The summer the drought came to Harlan County, Georgia. It arrived the way a bad decision arrives, quietly at first, then all at once, and with the particular cruelty of something that had been coming for a long time before anyone admitted it. By the third week of July, the red clay had drawn itself into deep parallel cracks along the shoulders of every county road, and the air smelled of dust and scorched pine straw and the faint mineral bitterness of a land that was beginning to lose its patience. That was the summer everyone in the county learned the name of a woman they had spent the better part of 14 months pretending not to know. And it was the summer that a key, no larger than a man's thumb, finally opened the only door it had ever been made to open. Nora Calloway stood on the porch of the old Prewitt place on the morning of the 23rd of July, and watched the cars pull in through the gate, one after another, raising small clouds of red dust that hung in the dead air and then settled back onto everything. They had come because they had no choice. 6 months ago, on a winter morning that she could still feel in the tendons of her wrists, she had been the one without a choice, standing in a different kind of crowd with her hands at her sides and the coat across her arm and $1,400 and some change in a bank account that had to last until the world decided to cooperate. The world had not cooperated. The world had done something stranger and more difficult than that. It had been right about something it hadn't even known it was saying. She watched the cars and she let them come. The arithmetic of the thing had been clear from the very beginning, if you were willing to look at it plainly. She had been willing. That was, in the end, the only difference between her and everyone else in the dry red county of Harlan on the 23rd of July. 14 months earlier, in the first cold week of May, Nora Calloway had driven a borrowed truck north on State Route 11 with everything she owned, loaded in the bed beneath the tarp and her daughter asleep in the passenger seat, and a brown envelope on the dash that contained the deed to 43 acres of played-out bottomland nobody in the county wanted. The divorce had been final for 8 weeks. The settlement had given her the truck and a number, and the number, after she paid the attorney's lien on it, was $9,412, which was supposed to represent the clean start that the judge's paperwork called it, though it felt considerably less clean than that. She was 38 years old. She had a daughter named Camille who was 9 and watched the world with large, still eyes and said less than most children her age, and she had a father she had been meaning to visit for 3 years who had died in March before she managed to get there. She had the coat he'd been wearing when they found him, because the hospital had sent it in a plastic bag with his wallet and his watch and a small folding knife. And she had not yet been able to decide what to do with any of those things, so they rode with her in the cab of the truck. Her father had been a quiet man, a man who fixed things, who kept accounts in a small spiral notebook he carried in his shirt pocket, who believed that a thing done well the first time was a form of respect for the thing itself. She had not inherited his patience, but she had inherited his arithmetic, the habit of writing down every number and making all the numbers agree. And that habit was what had brought her to Harlan County and to the 43 acres of bottomland in the first place. The land had been listed for $11,000, which was a price that announced its own embarrassment. The previous owner had attempted a catfish operation that had failed when the seasonal creek that fed his ponds had shifted course 18 inches south one spring and undermined the eastern embankment, which then collapsed and released 2 years of stocking investment into the county drainage system in a single wet afternoon. The man had departed Harlan County without forwarding arrangements and had eventually been located by a title company in Pensacola, Florida, where he was sufficiently chastened by events to accept $8,000 for the land and all remaining improvements, which included one small clapboard house with a sound roof and a failing well pump, 2 earthen ponds now gone dry and full of cracked mud and dead vegetation, an outbuilding of considerable age and uncertain structural philosophy, and 11 acres of second-growth timber that the county assessor had last valued at something less than the paper the assessment was printed on. Nora had offered $8,200, and the title company had called her within the hour to say the seller had accepted, sounding faintly embarrassed about it on his behalf. That left her $1,212 for everything else, which the arithmetic informed her was not a figure to take lightly. She had written it at the top of a fresh page in a spiral notebook of her own, honoring the old habit, and below it she had written the costs she could calculate and left blank lines for the ones she could not yet see. And she had told herself what her father used to tell himself, which was that every blank line was only an arithmetic problem that hadn't announced its terms yet. The coat was still in its hospital bag in the closet of the small clapboard house when she said it, and she did not yet know about the key. She found the key 3 weeks after she moved in on a Sunday evening in late May, when the light was long and gold through the single west-facing window of the back bedroom. She had decided to wash the coat, and she was checking the pockets in the methodical way her father had always insisted on before laundry. And the right side pocket yielded his handkerchief and a folded receipt from a hardware store dated the previous November, and the left side pocket yielded nothing. And she was about to put the coat in the machine when her fingers, running along the lining seam from the inside, found a small hard rectangle sewn into the fabric with a few neat tight stitches that her father had clearly made himself, because they were the same short, deliberate stitches he had used when he repaired a tear in her winter jacket the last Christmas she had come home, nearly 4 years before he died. She did not cut the stitches right away. She sat down on the edge of the bed with the coat across her lap and held the small hard shape through the fabric for a long while, because it felt important not to rush, because her father had taken the trouble to sew it there, and he had been a man who did not take trouble for casual reasons. After a while she took her small folding knife, her own folding knife, not his, and worked the stitches loose, and the key dropped into her palm. It was a small key, not a house key or a car key, more the shape and size of a key meant for a safe deposit box or a lock box or some kind of old-fashioned security drawer. There was nothing engraved on it except a number, 44. She turned it over twice. She held it up to the last of the long gold light through the window. Then she set it carefully on the windowsill and looked at it for a while. And Camille appeared in the doorway and looked at it too. And neither of them said anything for a moment. Camille said finally that it was a small key. Nora said yes, it was. Camille said that the number was 44. Nora said yes, it was. Camille went back down the hall, and Nora picked up the key and put it in her own shirt pocket, next to the spiral notebook, because that was where her father had always kept things he was thinking about. She did not tell anyone about the key for a long time, which turned out to be the right decision, though she had made it less from strategy than from the same instinct that keeps a person quiet when they are not yet sure what they know. In Harlan County that spring and early summer, she had very few people to tell things to, in any case. The community of Doyle's Mill, which served as the unofficial hub of the northern part of the county, had formed its opinion of Nora Calloway in a single morning in mid-May when she had stopped at the County Agricultural Extension Office to ask about soil remediation for pond sediment, and a man behind the counter had explained to her, with a patient thoroughness she had not requested, that the Prewitt bottomland was not a practical proposition for a woman alone, and that she might do better to look into selling it to someone who had the resources and the experience to make something of it. Nora had thanked him and asked her original question about the soil remediation, and he had answered it, less thoroughly, and she had written the answer in her notebook and left. The arithmetic of that exchange was plain enough. She was a newcomer, a divorced woman, who had paid $8,200 for 43 acres of proof that bad decisions made on that ground continued to accrue. The extension office man's opinion was shared with considerable creative embellishment by a substantial portion of Doyle's Mill, and this she knew because Doyle's Mill was the kind of place where embellished opinions circulated efficiently. The feed store on the county road was the principal circulation mechanism, and she had occasion to visit it twice in the first month, and both times the conversation among the men at the counter had altered its texture the moment she came through the door in a way that was not hostile exactly, but was unmistakable. The second time, a large prosperous man named Deacon Ferris, who ran the biggest conventional cattle operation in the northern end of the county, had offered, in a voice audible to the whole room, to take the bottomland off her hands for $10,000 cash, which he framed as doing her a kindness, since, in his estimation, the land was worth somewhat less than that to anyone who knew the county, but he was willing to make an exception in her case. She had said, "Thank you," she wasn't selling, and Deacon Ferris had smiled the kind of smile that contains a private verdict, and turned back to his conversation, and behind her, as she pushed through the screen door, she heard someone laugh. That was in June. By July, things had changed in several directions at once. The key had been the first change, though she had not yet understood what it opened. The second change came in the form of a neighbor named Marta Vasquez Hollis, who was 71 years old and had come to Harlan County from Oaxaca, Mexico, by way of a complicated 40-year route that had included 7 states and 2 husbands and a long period of beekeeping in the hill country of central Texas, and who lived on the 12 acres due south of the Prewitt bottomland, in a house surrounded by raised beds and fruit trees and a dozen wooden hive boxes painted in colors that had faded to a soft and dignified palette. Marta Vasquez Hollis had not laughed at Nora Calloway, and had not offered to buy her land, and had appeared at her gate on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of May with a jar of something amber and dense and a pan of cornbread, and had stood at the gate and said, without any preamble, that she had heard the new neighbor was trying to grow something on the old Prewitt ponds, and that she had come to say one thing, which was that the land there did not respond to being pushed. It responded to being listened to. She had said it the way someone states a well-established physical law, not as advice but as information, and then she had held out the jar and the cornbread, and waited. Nora had opened the gate. They had sat on the porch for 2 hours. Marta Vasquez Hollis had a voice that moved at its own pace and a way of pausing in the middle of a sentence to let the silence take the weight of what she was about to say. And she had told Nora that the bottomland along that stretch of Seasonal Creek had its own water logic, which was not the water logic of the surrounding county, and that the farmer who listened to the land's water logic would find that the land had been preparing something for a long time, the way a good host prepares for a guest whose date of arrival is uncertain, but whose welcome has never been in question. She had said it in those exact words, and the words had the particular quality of a thing that has been thought about for decades and is only now being said aloud, and Nora had written them in her notebook. Then Marta had looked at the spiral notebook and said that she had heard Nora's father was a man who kept accounts, and Nora had said yes. And Marta had said, "The land keeps accounts too. It has not forgotten what was taken and what was given. Begin with what the land has already said yes to, and you will spend half the energy for twice the result." Then she had gone home, and Nora had sat with the cornbread and the amber jar, which turned out to be the best honey she had ever tasted, and thought about what the land along the Seasonal Creek had already said yes to. What the Seasonal Creek said yes to, she discovered over the following 3 weeks of walking the property at different hours of the day and in different weather, was water. Not surface water, not the creek that had shifted its course and ruined the catfish man, but something deeper. The eastern end of the northern pond had never fully dried, even in the dry May they had been having. There was a seep, a slow dark bleed of groundwater through the clay about 8 feet below grade, and the seep had been maintaining a consistent patch of saturated soil roughly 30 feet in diameter in the corner of the old pond bed, and around that patch of saturated soil there was a corona of volunteer growth that had no business being as green and vigorous as it was in that dry spring. She had noticed it in her first week on the property and had filed it in the blank line section of her thinking, and now she walked back to it and sat beside it for a long while and thought about Marta's accounting metaphor and the key in her pocket and the number 44. The number 44 was what unlocked everything else, though she didn't know that yet in the way she would come to know it. She drove to the county seat on a Thursday and spent a morning in the clerk's office working through property records, and then deed abstracts, and then older records that had to be requested from a back room and brought out on a cart, the kind of brittle brown documents that smelled of a previous century's certainty. What she found after 3 hours of reading was that the 43 acres of the old Prewitt bottomland had been, prior to 1931, part of a larger parcel that had included an additional 9 acres to the northeast, and that on those 9 acres there had once been a small commercial operation of some kind, and that the structure associated with that operation had been removed from the county tax rolls in 1947, after which the 9 acres had been absorbed into what was then Harlan County's rural right-of-way allocation and had eventually, through a series of administrative reassignments she traced through 4 separate ledger books, ended up recorded as a county easement parcel. The easement parcel was still recorded. It had a parcel number. The parcel number was 44. She drove back to the property and sat in the truck for a while with the key on her palm and thought about her father, who had died in March, who had spent his retirement years doing what he had always done in his working years, which was researching things quietly and thoroughly and without announcing himself, and who had apparently, at some point in the years before he died, done exactly that research right down to the key he had sewn into his coat lining with the same deliberate stitches he'd used on her childhood jacket, and who had not called her to tell her because he had been waiting until she needed it, and she had not come home for 3 years. And then he had died before she came, and he had sent the coat instead. She cried in the truck once plainly, and then she put the key back in her pocket and drove back to the county clerk's office and asked to see the easement parcel file for number 44. The file for easement parcel 44 contained, among other bureaucratic sediment, a 1947 letter from the county road commissioner authorizing the administrative transfer and noting, in a subordinate clause at the end of the 4th paragraph, that the existing subsurface infrastructure associated with the former commercial operation was to remain undisturbed pending a future engineering assessment that, based on the remainder of the file, had apparently never been conducted. She asked the clerk what the former commercial operation had been. The clerk was a woman in her 60s who had been in that office since before the clerk she had replaced retired, and she looked at the letter and looked at the parcel number and went back to her office and came back with a hand-drawn map from 1928 that showed the parcel labeled, in faded ink, as the Doyle Artesian Spring and Bottling Works. The subsurface infrastructure was the well casing. The artesian well casing that had supplied the bottling operation. The county had never capped it, only covered it, and the seep at the northeast corner of the old pond bed was not a seep. It was an artesian upwelling through a hairline fracture in the well casing, and the water that had been maintaining that 30-foot corona of impossible green, for who knew how many years was coming up from the same limestone aquifer that had made the spring famous enough, 90 years earlier, to support a commercial bottling operation. She had the key that opened the access panel for the well casing. The access panel, she confirmed the following morning, was a small iron door set into a concrete block structure that had been so thoroughly overgrown by blackberry cane and kudzu that it was invisible from 10 feet away in any direction, except the one angle where Marta Vasquez Hollis's property line met the county easement, and where, she would later learn, Marta had cleared the brush herself one autumn years ago, because Marta had her own quiet relationship with the land's arithmetic and had been tending what she knew without announcing it to anyone. When she turned the key in the iron lock and pulled open the panel and looked down the casing and saw the water, dark and still and 8 feet below grade, she did not shout. She stood and let the information settle through her the way a long column of numbers settles into its total, slowly, from the bottom up. Then she called Marta from her cell phone and said, "I found it." And Marta said, "I know. I have been waiting for someone to find it for 11 years. Then there was a pause, and Marta said, in the cadence she used for the things she had been thinking about for a long time, "The land keeps the best of what it holds until the person arrives who is willing to be patient enough to receive it." That was Marta's way, and by now Nora was beginning to understand that every word Marta spoke about the land was also a word about people, and that the distinction was not as clear as it might appear. The artesian water was the banked coal. She had it tested by a certified laboratory in Atlanta, paying for the test with money she did not entirely have from the carefully tended arithmetic of her account, and the results came back showing a mineral profile consistent with a high-quality limestone aquifer source, clean, low in iron, slightly alkaline, and with a steady temperature that never varied more than 2 degrees, regardless of ambient conditions. The flow rate, once she cleared the debris from the fractured casing section and made a simple repair using materials from the county hardware store, was sufficient to fill the larger of the 2 old pond beds in approximately 11 days, after which it maintained a constant level through natural overflow to a drainage swale that ran back toward the seasonal creek's new channel. She had 2 functioning ponds, fed by artesian spring water. She did not tell anyone in Doyle's mill. She let them continue their existing opinion of her with all the thoroughness they wished to apply to it. This was also the summer that Camille befriended a boy named Theo Pratchett, who was 10 years old, 1 year older than Camille, and who lived with his grandmother in a 2-room house at the end of a dirt road half a mile east of the Prewitt bottomland. Theo's grandmother kept chickens and a garden and a careful silence about money, and Theo himself kept chickens and a garden and a careful silence about almost everything else, and he had appeared one morning in late June at the corner of the fence line, watching Camille do something with a bucket near the pond, and Camille had waved at him, and by the following morning he was there again with a pair of work gloves too large for his hands, and by the end of that week he was helping every morning before the heat came on. He named the 6 ducks that had appeared on the refilling pond one morning with a matter-of-fact authority that suggested the names had been self-evident. The largest was Admiral. Nora did not question this. She had lived long enough to understand that a 10-year-old who names animals and shows up consistently with oversized work gloves has already made a commitment that deserves more respect than a grown man's contract. Theo was the one who first told her about Deacon Ferris's plans for the northern county, though he didn't know that was what he was telling her. He mentioned, one morning in late June, that his grandmother had heard from Mrs. Alcott at the feed store that a company from Atlanta was buying up the water rights in the county, and that Deacon Ferris was involved because Deacon Ferris was always involved when there was something to consolidate, and that the company was called Meridian Agricultural Partners, and that they had already purchased the mineral and water rights to 14 separate parcels in the county's 2 southern townships. Nora wrote Meridian Agricultural Partners in her notebook and put a circle around it, and under the circle she drew a line, and under the line she wrote, "Blank line, terms not yet announced." The terms announced themselves in August, by which time the drought had been in possession of Harlan County for 6 weeks and was giving no indication of voluntary surrender. The ponds on the conventional cattle and poultry operations in the county were dropping at a rate the operators described as alarming, and 3 of the county's 7 registered farm wells had gone dry or gone brackish, and the creek and river levels throughout the watershed were at historic lows. The red clay roads gave off their dust continuously, the air smelled of scorch and patience running out, and the old Prewitt bottomland was the only place in the northern county where the water level had not changed by so much as an inch. She knew from the second week of the drought that this would become visible. She could not make the green invisible. She could not stop the ponds from remaining full when every other pond was going to thirst. She could only decide what she would do when the visibility became a conversation, and she had made that decision quietly before the conversation arrived, the way her father had always made his important decisions, in the notebook, in the arithmetic, before anyone asked him. The conversation arrived in stages. The first stage was a man from Meridian Agricultural Partners named Caldwell Price, who appeared at her gate on a Monday morning in the second week of August with a pressed linen shirt and a company card and a warmth of manner that was a professional tool deployed with considerable skill. He said he had heard wonderful things about what she had accomplished on the old Prewitt land, which was his way of saying he had been watching. He said Meridian Agricultural Partners was very interested in supporting sustainable water management in underserved rural communities, which was his way of saying he wanted what she had. He offered her $350,000 for the water rights and a 15-year pumping easement. He said it the way Deacon Ferris had said $10,000 for the land, which was to say, he said it as though the number were a kindness to her rather than a fraction of the thing's worth. She said she would think about it. She wrote $350,000 in her notebook, and then, beneath it, she wrote the number she had by then calculated as the rough value of the aquifer flow rate at prevailing bottled water wholesale prices over a 15-year term, which was a number that differed from $350,000 by slightly more than $3 million. And she drew a line under both numbers and wrote beneath the line, "A blank line is only an arithmetic problem that hasn't announced its terms yet." She was quoting herself, quoting her father, and she knew she was doing it, and she found it steadying. Caldwell Price came back on Wednesday with $390,000. She thanked him for his time. He came back the following Monday with $430,000 and a hint of a different warmth, the kind that is deployed when the professional warmth has not accomplished its goal. And he mentioned, in the fourth sentence of his conversation, that the county permitting office had flagged a potential compliance issue with the access modifications she had made to the easement parcel, and that Meridian Agricultural Partners had relationships with the county permitting office and might be in a position to assist in clarifying that situation. She wrote the word compliance in her notebook and drew a circle around it, not because she was worried, because she had already consulted a land attorney in Gainesville 3 weeks earlier on precisely that question, and had been told that her rights of beneficial use of the artesian flow were defensible and well established under Georgia water law. But because she wanted to remember the exact moment the professional warmth had shown her its other face. She said she appreciated his concern and that she would be in touch. He left, and this time there was no warmth of any description remaining in his departing posture. The drought reached its worst the third week of August. 3 conventional cattle operations in the county had sold early and sold cheap, 2 of them to parties the locals hadn't heard of, one of them to Meridian Agricultural Partners, whose name was now known throughout Doyle's Mill and whose methods were acquiring a clarity that the community was only just beginning to find uncomfortable. Deacon Ferris, who had been among the most vocal proponents of consolidation as recently as June, had gone quiet and was reported to be having conversations with his banker that were not going well. His main pond had dropped 4 feet in 6 weeks. His cattle were drawing down to the creek bedwater, which was sulphurous and warm and inadequate. He came to her on a Thursday morning, the 21st of August, in a truck he had not washed in weeks, which in Deacon Ferris was a statement of condition as legible as a balance sheet. He stood at her gate with his hat in his hands, literally, which she noted not to catalogue his humiliation, but because it seemed important that the gesture was involuntary, that he had taken the hat off before he was aware of doing it. The way the body tells a truth the person is still deciding whether to say. He said he needed water for 230 head of cattle and he could not pay her what it was worth, but he could pay her what he had, and what he had was limited. He named a figure. She looked at the number and thought about it, and thought about 230 animals in that heat, with sulphurous creek water, and the arithmetic of what sufficient water would cost to truck in versus what he was offering, and she said, "I'll run the pipe to your south fence line, and you run it from there to your pond, and we'll settle the bill in December when the rains come back and you know what you have." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was working through several registers at once. He said, "You do that." Not a question exactly. She said, "The animals need water." He put his hat back on. He said he was sorry about the feed store back in June. She said she appreciated that. He left, and she called Theo's grandmother to ask if Theo could come help her run some pipe, and Theo's grandmother said Theo was already on his way. The community meeting on the 23rd of August had been called by the County Agricultural Extension Board to discuss the water crisis and the Meridian Agricultural Partners offer, which had been extended to the county itself in the form of a proposal to purchase the county's remaining unallocated water rights and develop a regional distribution system at rates to be set by Meridian. The proposal was being presented by Caldwell Price, who was wearing the same linen shirt and the same deployed warmth, and who had a presentation with several charts. About 60 people were in the community center, which was hot and smelled of dry wood and anxiety, and Nora Calloway was among them in the fourth row from the back with her notebook and her pen, and Marta Vasquez Hollis was 2 seats to her right. And Theo was not there because he was 11 and it was a school night, but he had asked her that morning what was going to happen at the meeting, and she had said she did not know yet. The presentation proceeded for 30 minutes. Caldwell Price was fluent and polished, and the warmth was at full professional deployment. The rates on his chart were described as community support pricing, and they were not community support prices. Nora knew this because she had spent an evening with a calculator and the wholesale water markets data, which is publicly available, and the numbers on his chart were not community support numbers. They were extraction numbers, the kind of numbers that look reasonable in the middle of a drought and look considerably different when the drought ends and the contract term still has 11 years remaining. When he opened the floor for questions, 3 people asked questions that were really expressions of desperation in a question's grammatical form, and Caldwell Price answered them with deployed warmth and 4 of his charts, and then Nora raised her hand. He called on her with a fraction of a hesitation, just enough to show he knew who she was, and she stood up and said, "You mentioned in your presentation that the Northern County artesian source is not currently accessible to the distribution proposal." She said it quietly, as a plain statement, and she watched him absorb it. He said, "That's correct. The private well site is not part of the current proposal." She said, "You mentioned the volume at 60 gallons per minute." He said, "Yes." She said, "Your hydrological survey must be recent because I only completed the casing repair in early July, and the flow rate measurements I have access to differ somewhat from 60 gallons per minute." There was a stillness in the room. She said, "I have 41 gallons per minute in my own records. 60 gallons per minute would require a separate measurement from an access point I have not granted to anyone." The stillness deepened. Caldwell Price's warmth did not falter exactly, but it shifted register, the way a transmitted signal shifts when it encounters interference, and he said he might have been working from historical data. She said, "The historical data from the 1928 survey shows 38 gallons per minute." He had no answer to that, because there was no good answer to it, and the room understood in the space of that silence what kind of operation was being presented to them. She sat down. The meeting continued, but Caldwell Price's warmth had no useful work left to do, and the county board chair, a woman named Gertrude Osei, who had been in that chair for 11 years and had a very particular face for when she had seen enough, made a brief statement that the county would be taking the Meridian proposal under extended review, and thanked everyone for coming, and Caldwell Price gathered his charts with a contained and professional displeasure and left, and several people in the room turned and looked at Nora. She had gone home that night and sat on the porch with the key in her hand and looked at the dark shape of the ponds in the moonlight, the water still and full and real, and she had thought about her father, who had done the research quietly and without announcing himself, and who had sewn the key into the lining with careful stitches, and who had waited for her to need it, and she thought that what he had given her was not only the key and the water, but the understanding that a thing done well the first time is a form of respect for the thing itself, and that patience and the willingness to sit with blank lines until they announce their terms is the most practical skill there is. And she thought that she missed him with an ache that was no longer sharp but had become structural, like a load-bearing beam, something the whole house relied on, even when you forgot it was there. The meeting on the 23rd of July was the morning she had opened with, the morning the cars came through the gate, raising small red clouds. The 23rd of August was what she had said, the morning after the community meeting, which was the date she had chosen to hold what she thought of in her notebook as the distribution arrangement, and which the county would later describe in its own records more officially. She had spent the morning of the 22nd writing the terms in her notebook, checking the arithmetic 3 times, and calling Gertrude Osei at the county board and walking her through the proposal. The proposal was this. She would open the artesian source to community distribution for the remainder of the drought at a cost to each operator of $50 per week for the piping labor and maintenance, which was a formality, a way of making it a transaction instead of a gift, because her father had taught her that people who can pay something keep their dignity better than people who can only receive, and dignity in a drought is worth preserving. The $50 per week went into a joint account with the County Extension Board to fund soil and water conservation work after the drought ended. Deacon Ferris was the third car through the gate on the 23rd of August. He got out and went to the back of his truck and got out 2 pipe wrenches and a length of threaded galvanized pipe without being asked, and started walking toward the distribution point, and several other men did the same with their own tools, and the morning became a work morning, which was the kind of morning Nora Calloway understood best. Marta was there with coffee in a large thermos, and with Theo, who had asked his grandmother with considerable urgency if he could miss school, and his grandmother had said yes, because she understood the arithmetic of what was happening. Theo went straight to the main distribution valve and stood by it with the seriousness of a person who has been assigned a responsibility and intends to honor it. And Nora looked at him and thought that he was exactly right to be serious, because the responsibility was real, and the water was real, and the animals in the dry red county were waiting. The rains came back in the 3rd week of September, which was 2 weeks earlier than the average end date for drought conditions in that part of Georgia, as if the land had registered the change in how it was being treated and had adjusted its schedule accordingly, though she knew better than to say that to anyone who would argue about it, which was most people. She said it to Marta. Marta said, "Of course it did." The land keeps its accounts. By the end of October, the County Extension Board had completed a formal assessment of the artesian source and had designated it a County Historic Resource, which meant the easement parcel 44 returned formally to the public record in a way that protected it from private purchase. Nora retained the beneficial use rights and the maintenance access. It was a clean arrangement, and the land attorney in Gainesville said it was as solid as anything she had seen in 20 years of rural water law. On a Friday afternoon in November, Marta came to the porch with another jar of honey and sat down and said nothing for a while in the companionable way she had, the way that didn't require filling. The light was the low gold light of a November afternoon in North Georgia, and the ponds were full, and the trees along the pond edges had gone to their autumn colors, and somewhere on the water, Admiral and his companions were conducting their affairs with the authority of animals who have been named and have accepted the name as reasonable. Marta said, "Your father, he came here once, did you know?" Nora said she hadn't known. Marta said, 3 years ago, maybe 4. He walked the property from the fence line. He looked at the corner of the north pond for a long time. He spoke to no one because he did not want to make a noise. He just looked and then went away. I watched him from the fence line. I knew what he was looking at. Nora said, "Did you speak to him?" Marta said, "I thought about it. I decided he was making his arrangements in his own way, and it wasn't for me to hurry him." She poured honey into a jar lid and held it out, and a late yellow jacket, drunk with autumn, came and found it. Marta watched the yellow jacket and said, "He knew it would be here when someone arrived who was ready for it." She paused. He was very patient about it, for a man who was running out of time. Nora held the key in her hand. She had been carrying it in her shirt pocket since May, and she had decided some weeks ago that she was going to keep carrying it there, next to the notebook, not because she needed to keep finding the lock, because she had found it, but because the weight of it reminded her of the stitches her father had made and the patience he had required of himself and the form of respect that a thing done well the first time represents. The key was not a symbol. It was a small iron fact, and it opened a specific door, and behind the door was water, and the water was real, and the people and the animals in the dry red county had drunk it, and the accounts were clear. She put the key back in her pocket and watched the last of the yellow light move across the surface of the north pond, and the water held the light the way water does, steadily, without holding on to it. And the ponds were full, and the land was quiet, and somewhere in the quiet there was the low sound of water moving through a limestone formation that had been moving through it for 10,000 years without asking anyone's permission or requiring anyone's acknowledgement, patient and cold and prepared, keeping its accounts, waiting.